it's being recorded from here on. So I'm going to turn my attention now to the PowerPoint slides. I may go back to the video screen for teaching purposes. We'll see. So chapter 3 follows obviously chapter 2. In chapter 2, we took a look at culture from the point of view of sociological reflection. And so socialization is the process by which people learn their culture. And part of our challenge as students in being introduced to and introducing ourselves to sociology as a more or less scientific practice. What is it we mean by learn in this context? We're in a classroom, sort of, and we're used to thinking of learning as a more or less formalized kind of, a more or less institutionalized kind of process and activity. But in this case, socialization, hopefully you've read the chapter, if you've read the chapter, socialization is broader than simply the narrower events and outcomes of a classroom, which is often what we think of when we think of learning. So socialization is the process by which people, I think a better way of looking at it is internalize their culture. Many of the components of what we broadly and I think readily enough and accurately think of as socialization occurred prior to our really being aware of anything at all. We're each one of us, or at least almost each one of us, I think each one of us, but I obviously can't know that, almost certainly each one of us will have been, will have acquired, will have in a sense learned all kinds of practices and so on before we even remember, before we even acquired a sense of ourselves. And this occurs very, very early in human life. And so, for example, in chapter 2, the book describes the central role that language plays in culture. And none of us can remember, I would argue anyway, that none of us can remember learning language. Does anyone here believe that they remember learning their language? Now, I'm not saying you don't remember learning a word in your language. Of course, it's possible. Maybe this afternoon you'll learn a word. What I'm talking about is the transition from being pre-linguistic, if we ever were pre-linguistic. That's a trickier topic. But at a certain stage, around 2 years old for most humans, as far as I understand, we begin to be able to respond to verbal cues from the people around us, and we begin to be able to reproduce them. And by the time roughly that we're 3 years old, we have and here linguists disagree, and it's complicated and very controversial, but we have a basically complete command of the language by the time we're 3 years old, for the most part. Our language, very surprisingly, and it's a very difficult thing to understand, our command of the language doesn't really improve that much from 3 years old on in most cases. But now what does this process amount to? I just want to remind us, I want to take a step back before we take a step forward. Socialization is the learning of our culture, and culture is the socially transmitted practices, languages, symbols, beliefs, values, ideologies, and material objects that people create to deal with real life problems. And so socialization is this transmission of all of these strategies that are available to solve the problems that our life throws up for us. And in part, what the sociological approach considers and tries to understand and in some cases intervene on is the consequences of not solving these problems. What happens when we don't solve a problem? Generally, it doesn't go away. And a great deal of the content of our culture amounts to solutions to problems that the people who came before us came up with. And so we seamlessly, for the most part, seamlessly internalize the vast majority of the solutions to the problems that confronted people who came before us. And as we go along as a society and in all the different groups that we're part of, the solutions are adapted for as long as the sort of adaptive potential of those solutions function effectively. And over time, we reject a whole bunch of solutions that had worked or been believed to work or worked to some degree in the past. And moving forward, all societies, no matter how conservative, small c conservative they might seem to be, all societies that we have any evidence of at all, any sort of historically deep evidence, all societies adapt to their surroundings. Societies that are frozen, that are unable to adapt to their surroundings, disappear. And so culture and society are always, on a long enough time scale, adaptive processes. Now, so what I want to take a look at this afternoon with you is how does this socialization occur? And the slides that were provided us, the slides that were provided to me that I'm happy to share with you, they describe it, they use the vocabulary that is typically used in especially North American sociology, intro to sociology textbooks. And after introducing what socialization is, all the textbooks I've ever seen turn their attention to what they describe as the agents of socialization. And by that, they largely mean the institutional processes through which socialization occurs. And in this textbook, one of the strengths of this textbook, of the slides for sure, is that the three of the most widely adopted within sociology, three of the most widely adopted theoretical frameworks that are applied to sociological knowledge production and sociological teaching are described in terms of their account of the dynamics of socialization. What forces are at work? How do they contribute to, and what is the result of this process of learning our culture? And those three dominant strategies, those three dominant theories, let's say, are functionalism, conflict theory, and feminist theory, and those I'll just have to move on, and symbolic interactionism. Now, symbolic interactionism was introduced in chapter 2 in the framework of culture. Here in the context of socialization, in the earlier part of the chapter, The symbolic interactionist account is introduced through the work of Charles Horton Cooley and the Looking Glass Self, and then the amendments to Cooley's view that were developed by George Herbert Mead at the University of Chicago in the early part of the 20th century. And the key contribution to sociology, or one of the key contributions Mead makes to the early institution, the early practice of sociology as, on the one hand, a university teaching discipline, and on the other hand, a university research discipline, is this notion of a developmental self. The human self develops through stages. And in a certain kind of way, I have to confess, though, that I don't know for sure what Mead's own view on the claim I'm going to make, but the contrast I'd like you to consider for a second is between an earlier notion, a pre-modern notion of the self that was widespread in Western culture, and that would be the Christian notion of the soul. And the modern sociological conception of the self is that it's not produced fully formed at birth. The self develops. The self has a developmental course. The self develops from whatever it is at birth through stages to, and here there's all kinds of different ways that is spelled out, but Mead's important contribution is that it's through stages that the self develops very early on in life. And so Mead called the attention of and framed the way sociologists were able to build on what, from a psychological component, from the discipline of psychology, was a much more obvious point of view, and that is how young children develop all of the in the statistically speaking normal course of human development. Children at an early age acquire the different psychological components that goes up to the together combine to produce the functioning psychological human. What George Herbert Mead did was he took those psychological insights and tried to develop and tried to articulate an understanding of how that developmental self allows us to understand and also is impacted by the social world within which that psychological self develops. And so these agents of socialization, what is that social framework within which the self develops? These are, in the first instance, for most humans throughout most of human history that we know about, it's the family. Now, a sociological challenge to working through how we might understand that has to do with what it is we mean by the family. And in different historical periods, in different cultures, in different contexts, what we mean by the family varies, and the way it varies often has very, very important different kinds of consequences for the individuals who are members of these different groups and also the societies that are composed of these different groups. That'll be a topic for a later chapter. Right now, I'm going to focus on the notion of the family, however it might turn out to be configured. For the purpose of developing, or for the purpose of spelling out what most sociologists mean by primary socialization, what we'll use for our definition, our working definition of family, simply the people who are in contact the most and the most often with the infant and the young child as that young child gets older. And so, whatever the nature of the relationships that exist at from the earliest time, from birth onwards, the people who surround human infants, not at all surprisingly, but the consequences of this dynamic are what it is that is referred to by the notion of, or by the description of, an agent of socialization. So what is this? So the family, however it's defined, turns out to be the most important agent of primary socialization. The consequences, the social consequences downstream, the data here is very, very clear. There's an enormous amount of collected evidence, and that collected evidence feeds back through our society to our own understanding of our positions in our lives. For most of us, we experience ourselves as having been importantly shaped primarily by the impact of our family on us. And that remains true over the entire life course. So you're 20, I'm 60, and even at 60, it still feels like, looking back on the past and looking at my life right now and looking at whatever's left of the future of my life, it's still the case that it seems to me, even in my more unreflective moments, that in my experience of being alive, my family, the individuals who surrounded me early on and who continue to surround me, have had a tremendous impact, for better and for worse, around all of the ways that I learned to survive and adapt and thrive in the world. Now, I want to stress, and it's a difficult reality for some people, that this is not always a great thing, that there are family situations that can be very, very difficult. It's the other day on the news, 2 days ago on the news, on the CBC, there was a news story early on in the day about a stabbing that took place in Vaughan. And the only, I haven't seen the follow-up news stories, but the early bits of the news was that there were two people killed. There was a male and a female killed, and it was a stabbing, and they were young people and older people, and the expectation, if you follow the news, the expectation is going to be what? What is it that you think is the most likely description of what happened in that case? There was an adult male who was killed by the police as a result of the police having been called to that address with a report of violence. And when the police got there, there was already a dead person and 3 injured young people. And in the police's interaction with the male on the premises, that male was killed by the police. Sadly. So does anybody have any guesses about what happened, or does anyone actually know? Well, unfortunately, the likelihood is that it was that there was family violence that was going on. It's super unlikely, statistically speaking, that it was a stranger who broke into the house and took the family hostage and just killed them. although family is important, not just in a good way, but also in all of the different ways that things can be important to humans who interact with other humans. And violence, unfortunately, is still a permanent background possibility in all human interactions. Now, for the most part, for most people, anyway, I will skip that generalization. So uh, it's worth noting, and it's an important part of what sociologists try to understand. What are the ways that family interactions are functional for a society? In what ways do they do a good job at preparing individual humans to participate in groups of humans in such a way that the groups and the individuals in the groups benefit and are able to realize their potential to the greatest degree possible? And also, what are some of the ways that the families reproduce suboptimal ways of interacting? What are some of the ways that families are constructed such that negative interactions are more likely, or negative interactions, negative attitudes, dysfunctional aptitudes are reproduced and transmitted? So an example from one of the discussion boards was, I believe it was in this section, but I may be mistaken. Maybe it was in a different section. One of the students in their discussion board mentioned that in some families, parents use physical parents use physical force to discipline their children, and in some other families, parents don't use that physical force to discipline their children. Sociologists have studied the consequences of those strategies, and there's a lot of data on this. The results are fairly clear on that topic, but that's an example of ways that sociologists turn their attention to how families operate. And among the most important features of that sociological attention is highlighted, is captured by the insight that this student brought. That is that the way you're raised has an impact on how you in turn will raise the family, if when you become an adult or when you get older, if you have your own children. So families are reproductive structures, both in a sort of in a biological sense, but that represents a choice, an individual choice to some extent anyway, but also in a sociological sense. So biological reproduction is assured through families, biologically speaking, if we organize the family as a biological unit. But as a sociological unit, it's not just as a sperm donor and an egg donor that biological parents reproduce the species. It's also as a vehicle through which, as a mechanism through which, as a dynamic through which, as we saw, socialization occurs. That is the learning of the culture, understood broadly as the skills and aptitudes and so on that allow us to, or fail to allow us to, respond to the problems that will face us moving forward as we get on. And so the family reproduces the set of strategies that are available to, or a subset of the strategies that are available at any given particular historical time. One of those key features is, how are children going to be disciplined? And one thing sociologists study is which method, what are the consequences of one method versus another method. Now, in that posting, the student made a claim that, well, at the very least, that I disagree with, and it seems to me is not just mistaken, but in a way impossible. The student said that children will raise their children the way they themselves were raised, and that's automatically. I forget what the exact quote is, and that's not the case. And it's I'm not raising this point to focus my attention on the particular student who made this claim. What the student said is true and important, but incomplete. One of the ways that social structures are reproduced through families is by adaptation, not just the reproduction of the exact same strategy, but sometimes what happens is from one generation to the next, the strategy reveals itself to be counterproductive or suboptimal, and the next generation adapts that strategy. So what happens is some children who were physically disciplined as children grow up to be adults who, because they were physically disciplined and they believe, or they have come to believe, that that is not a good strategy, either because they think it's morally wrong or because they believe it doesn't work or for any other reason, they come to the conclusion that spanking's not the right way to raise your children. And so they raise their children without spanking them precisely because they were spanked as children. That's still, from a sociological point of view, one of the ways that the family is a mechanism for socialization. It's an adaptive mechanism as well. And that is an important way that sociology differs from our own everyday experiences, or can differ anyway from our own everyday experiences. Yeah, you may remember either from one of my lectures or from reading the textbook, or you might not have come across this, but sociology emerges in the late 19th century in Europe. So there's a specific historical and social context in which this occurred. And namely, that is at a time period and in a place where the reach of public education was expanding dramatically. So in the late 19th century, in most countries in Europe, public education was more and more widely available, and state-sponsored, tax-paid public education was increasingly available to everybody. But this was a new historical development, and the impact of education had not yet really begun to be fully internalized into the cultural self-understanding of European society. But fairly quickly, as sociology developed, so early enough on in the 20th century, it became a fact, and then it became a fact that was understood to be sociologically relevant, that many humans are socialized not just in the family, but also importantly in the school. So the family and public education in particular, the publicly available school system, become the two most widely studied agents of socialization within sociological research. And there are two components to why sociologists believe that these are the most most sociologists still believe that these are the two most important dynamics and forces and institutions and agents of socialization. On the one hand, because most people go through both of these institutions, but also and separately because these institutions humans interact in these institutions at the youngest age. It's a crucial feature of human existence that that we age, that we are born at age 0 and that we change over time in many respects, maybe in every respect, but at least in many respects. And that change is not like water running in a stream or something. The timing of these changes turns out to have a potential dramatic consequences on how the individual's life is going to go, but also on how society is going to be organized. And so in the late 20th century, in the early 21st century, well, let me take a step back. Later in the semester and in the second part of the course, we'll see how in Canada anyway, and in many other parts of the world, starting in the late 60s, early 70s, increasingly more and more women began to enter into the paid labor market. And that represented a significant difference in the social organization of Canadians' lives. One of the consequences of that was that children were no longer spending as much time with their parents as they were. A mom, no matter how gifted she is, no matter how skilled she is, no matter what she tells you, she can't be in 2 places at one time. And so what happens is society had to adapt to that fact, and the way they did it was, the way it happened in Canada anyway, was that daycare was developed. The public education began a little bit earlier, and other institutions were adapted such that children began to spend more and more time together in outside of family contexts. And so the changes that brought about were an object of sociological reflection. There were concerns expressed from different segments of the population around the potential consequences of that change, that at least perceived change. And in fact, it was, without a doubt, there's no serious way of doubting it, this represented a change in the way humans' lives were organized in Canada starting in the 70s. Now it's a much more widespread, much more common, let's say, more statistically speaking, common feature of the way Canadian society is organized. When you get older, you get a job, and that's no longer nearly as gendered a realization. Now, it remains the case that women get paid less for work, even work of the same value. That's an analytically separate issue. But that fact is also tied to, at least arguably, to the way children are raised in their families at the youngest age. It's at the youngest age, in the context of our very earliest experiences, that we begin to internalize our understandings of what gender is and what gender relations are. And that starts in the context of the family, it continues in the context of the school, and it continues throughout later in the life course. And so the public school system is increasingly responsible for what is described in a more or less neutral kind of, in an attempt at a neutral sort of account, secondary socialization. Socialization outside the family after early childhood. And so we get the 2 different mechanisms that overlap, but interact with some kind of with less than perfect seamlessness. Yes, sir.
Hello, so can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. The question I have for the assignment is, what do we have to do exactly regarding death that are in the textbook through chapter 1 and 3.
So the news analysis, is that what you're talking about?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so part of the task is that you're required to use your imagination. And part of what I'm trying to do is to allow you to see that although it sounds like and it feels like you're asking the right question, what exactly do I want you to do? In fact, you're not understanding what I want if you think that there's a way that I can exactly describe what I'm looking for you to do. What I'm looking for you to do is to describe using your own vocabulary how you understand the vocabulary that's highlighted by those terms and how it connects to the news item. Sociology positions itself in between your own understanding of the world and the sociological understanding of that world. And so you need to, so have you, can you remember one of the terms that you've looked at?
Yeah, 1 second. I wrote it down for the assignment.
Good.
I looked at, where did I write it down?
I have the book right here, so if you tell me the page, then we'll be on the same, literally on the same page.
Yeah, I think it was from chapter 2. I looked at society and abstraction.
So abstraction, the human capacity to generate general ideas or ways of thinking that are not linked to particular instances.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So now, what you need to do, I'll just, with your permission here, open up the description that I gave you, the assignment description. This will take a second. Okay, so then let me go to the news story. Oh, hang on. I'm going to tie this into the chapter in a second. So this is good in two different ways. Okay, so now I'm going to try to go to the news story, see if I can get it on the. Okay, so is that on screen right now, the CBC story?
Yeah.
Okay, so now. Let me just find. Okay, so here we get a quote from the mom's point of view. It's obviously not fair to the kids if they're suddenly thrown back into, hopefully, a regular school in September and be expected to go full speed into the regular curriculum if they're already behind from the year before. So now, in order to be able to make the claim about fairness, the mom has to abstract from the particular conditions. She's not saying that it's not good for my kids. She's not saying she's making the claim that there's an expectation of fairness. The way the school system's supposed to work is that everybody's supposed to be able to get benefits from the school. Does that seem about right to you? Well, let me start over here. Let me get the, so I'll just read from my description. Oh, wait a minute, that's, okay, so in our textbook, the author has identified key sociological concepts by printing them in boldface. You need to pick 3 terms from each of the chapters 1, 2, and 3 and describe how they can be used to relate to some aspect of the news story. So maybe abstract is going to be, I'm going to pick a different term. And then go to the news story here over here. Okay, well, this is a little trickier, but let's do it. The news story is itself part of our culture. And part of the news story involves this photo. Now, how does the news story use this photo to capture your attention? Well, we know that our definition of culture on the same page in the textbook, it says, the socially transmitted practices, languages, symbols, beliefs, etc., blah, 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 that people create to deal with real life problems. Well, using this picture connects us in a certain way as consumers of this news story. It makes the story about these people just that much more real than it would be without it. When we just read it with the words, we see Monica Bellia, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, and her children. And many of us, especially if you're parents, we can imagine, and if you are parents and you have children who are in school, then all of this will be immediately real to, is likely to be immediately real to you. But including a photo in there, it puts a face to the notion of actual children. So here we're looking at Monica and her children. It brings us into this story in a way that's more immediate, for some of us anyway, that's more immediate. So that would be one way, what I just said now, if you wrote that out, that would be one way of illustrating the connection between these words, these key concepts from the chapter and what's going on in the news story. Now, partly, now I'm losing my, okay, here we go. Back to here. So now, Maziar, first of all, does that help at all? Okay. So now I'm going to try to return. So you've done me a favor here by raising the issue. First of all, I'm glad you raised it. I hope that other students who might have been unclear on what the assignment requires will have been helped also. But I want to use what Maziar did to spell out some of the ways in which sociologists understand the socializing function of schools. So here, let me go, I'm going to go back now to my slides. Just bear with me here, please. So in the public school system in grade 1 and grade 2, what is the public schools? What is it that students learn of lifelong lasting value when they're in when they're 5 and 6 and 7 years old. Huh. Well, I'm going to push back a tiny little bit here. I don't think that's quite accurate. I think that they're taught to question authority under a certain in certain kinds of ways. If so, in 2021, or I guess I'm going to have to go to a little bit later. My kids are old, and so my own more direct experience with public education is 15, 17 years old. But even back then, students were often, in general, officially encouraged to ask questions. So you were told to put your hand up if you had to go to the bathroom, for example. You weren't told suck it up until the end of, you weren't told, as a matter of course, might have had individual teachers who did this, but by and large, the school system is set up in order to teach you, right, exactly. So the questioning of authority is, you're trained to literally question authority, to ask questions under certain conditions only. When you're in grade 1, most children in grade 1 are able to not pee their pants, right? So but they still are developing bladder control. And so sometimes they have to pee, and they're taught to put their hands up. They're taught to not just go to the bathroom on their own. They're taught that their time is no longer just their own time. There's an authority structure in the classroom, and they have some limited access to that authority structure as long as they follow the rules. Now that breaks down in practice for sure, but one of the things that the school system does is that it produces a relationship to authority that is flexible enough to allow for a better distribution of the effort that's being put into the classroom setting for the longer term goals. So if all the children, for example, when I was in grade 1 and grade 2, I went to school in Quebec. I think the rules were the same in Quebec as they were in Ontario, but teachers were still regularly still used corporal punishment against students. And so if you could still get the strap from the principal if you misbehaved in certain ways. Now that was used in my own experience. Anyway, I was in quotes a good boy, so I never got the strap at school. I very, very rarely got into trouble until later in high school, but that's a different story that I won't bother you with. But in elementary school, I never got into trouble, but I knew people who got into trouble, and every once in a while, if they got into bad enough trouble, they might get smacked by the principal. And again, this never happened to me, but I had many classmates where teachers administered corporal punishment in the classroom. It turns out most people believe, certainly I believe this, that an atmosphere of violence in a classroom massively diminishes the efficiency with which students learn what it is they're supposed to learn. It's perhaps easier to keep students quiet if you smack them, maybe. But if the goal is just to keep students quiet, you don't need all the other complicated things that go on in a classroom. The goal in grade 1, the goal in grade 2, the goal in grade 3 is not to keep students quiet. The goal in grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3 is to teach them arithmetic and spelling and all the other things. One of the goals is to do all that. If a reign of terror is exercised by the teacher and by the school administration, some students will still learn nonetheless how to do the arithmetic, but overall, the learning atmosphere is compromised by the use of violence. Terrified children, terrified humans don't learn as well. The balance that has to be struck is children, if the children are yelling all class long, then they won't be learning either. A new strategy has been developed to achieve the better balancing of those two different goals. Now, in this context, I was developing, I was going blah, 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 socialization. Maziar understands, I imagine he understands. I'm sort of reconstructing what I think was going on in his mind, and I hope he'll correct me if I'm mistaken. Maziar sees that there's an assignment due. It's 20% of the grade. He's a serious person, I guess. He wants to do a good job, and he wants to get a good grade on that assignment. He's not sure what to do, so he asked a question that had nothing to do, at least not seemingly, with what I was talking about. Maziar pushed back against my authority to control what we're doing in class right now and relied on his own authority in this context, the latitude that he has appropriately understood that he's allowed to ask a question. If he had asked me, well, what do I think about the Raptors game last night? That would have been a different kind of question. It would have been much more outside of the context of what's going on in this class. But Maziar wanted to know something, so he asked that question. He was pursuing, I take it, his own interests, and in pursuing his own interests, he interrupted what I was doing, I think appropriately, and so I'm not berating Maziar. I want to illustrate that by doing that, he is, and we are, in fact, accomplishing one of the goals, one of the socialization effects of post-secondary education. When all of you graduate from our program and you go to U of T and you graduate from that program and then you get some excellent job, some good middle-class job with prospects of promotions and of doing important work, the organizations you are working in are going to depend on their employees being able to make sure that they're always, or as often as possible, in a position to do a good job at what they're doing. And in order to do that, they need to make sure they understand what the hell the boss wants from them in the first place. I expect that there's a number of you who were, like Maziar, not 100% sure they understood what the assignment was. But for a number of different reasons, you have not yet internalized that cultural norm that exists in Ontario society, that you have to take responsibility up to a certain negotiable limit around what can you ask the people who are above you in the hierarchy about the tasks that you've been set. Now, does any of this make any sense to anybody? So Maziar's done us all a solid in a couple of different ways. And so one of the things that the college is supposed to do is to encourage you to become a more critical thinker than you already are. And Maziar put that into practice. I'm not positive that Maziar thought, I know what I'll do. I will help Tony illustrate how socialization works by, X, Y, and Z. I think Maziar, when he logged in, told himself he was going to ask, what the hell is this stupid assignment about? He was going to say it in a nicer way. And he waited as long as he could. And then he saw the clock was ticking. And eventually He typed in his question. How far off am I there, Maziar? Is that about right? Yeah. And Maziar has at least one important quality. Quality is a good word, I guess, that is of high value to people who are in charge of organizations, employers, and other. He has the ability to uh, formulate productively formulate questions that are going to make it easier for him to perform the tasks that he's been set by the institution that he's participating in. And he asked it in a way that is going to benefit everybody who is paying attention, or has a chance at least of benefiting everybody else who's trying to perform that task. Our class worked better today because Maziar, I think anyway, our class today will have worked better because Maziar asked that question. And in asking that question, he's illustrated one of the ways that the school system functions as a mechanism, as an agent of socialization. Your employers are relying on you when you don't fully understand the task that's been set to figure out ways to productively correct that misunderstanding. In fact, I suspect that Maziar would have been able to do a fine job without my answering that question, but he wanted to be sure. Now, I might be mistaken about that last part, but I suspect that that's the case. I imagine also that there might be students who were even less clear than Maziar was, to the extent that they haven't even looked at the thing yet. It hasn't even occurred to them to take a look at the assignment. And now that Maziar's raised this, they're going to think, shit, I better get on this. It's due, whenever it's, I don't even remember. So that in a number of different ways, and that's how that illustrates, thank you, Sonia, that illustrates the complex nature of how socialization works. So the clock is running down now, but Maziar's question allowed me to give a little bit of a elucidation on that assignment, and also demonstrate, I think, in a practical way, one of the senses in which sociologists understand at the broadest level what functions are, how they enter into the way institutions operate, and how on your side you are engaged in the operation of these sociological notions. So the college, in addition to teaching you about sociology and socialization and so on, is, or through doing that, is also, and at the same time and through that very same process, preparing you for the world of work. Insofar as it's successful in doing that, then it's paying for itself in a certain way. Your employers, the organizations in which you will be employed, some of the money that those organizations generate feed back into the tax system. That tax system pays my salary, pays for the internet at the college and so on, and creates the possibility of you learning this, so that there's a feedback loop between, on the one hand, you as students internalizing this culture, and also an intersecting feedback loop with the institutions through which our culture and our society produce and reproduce the conditions for our survival in this on this planet. And when those two feedback loops are operating properly, they reinforce each other. And that reinforcing nature of functions is the central metaphor for structural functionalism. Next week, I'll take a look at how the conflict theory analyzes the way that these interlocking functions and the reinforcing nature of these interlocking functions doesn't always work, and how those instances of where these interlocking functions and where these feedback loops fail to produce and reproduce desired outcomes, how a systematic description of that failure provides us with an even more accurate description of how society operates. That is, how conflicts are really the more accurate underlying baseline reality of human societies, rather than the coordination of the successful coordination of the different levels of functions that characterize our society. So with that, fortuitous intervention on Maziar's part, although I had other things in mind, Maziar's question, I think, probably almost certainly was a much better way of doing what I was hoping to do today. And Maziar, with your permission, I won't name you, but in my I have one more class this week, one more section this week. I'm going to basically do the same thing with my next section on this topic for agents of socialization. So it's now 3 minutes after our 1 hour allotted time. So I will turn off the recording now, and if there are no more questions, I will wish you all a good week, a good rest of your weeks.